the Great Puritan Migration stands as a pivotal moment in American history, shaping the nation's spiritual, social, and political landscape. As thousands of English Puritans crossed the Atlantic, they carried with them a dream of building a godly community that would forever alter the course of human events. Join me on this epic journey to uncover the origins, struggles, and lasting legacy of the Great Puritan Migration, where faith, freedom, and the future of a nation were forged. As we delve into the origins of English Puritanism, we find ourselves in the tumultuous landscape of 16th century England, where the Church of England's attempts to navigate the treacherous waters of theological reform had sparked a maelstrom of dissent. The roots of Puritan discontent lay in the incomplete nature of the English Reformation, which had retained many of the trappings of Catholicism, from episcopal governance to elaborate rituals. For those who sought a more radical break with Rome, the Church of England's compromises seemed a half measure, a lukewarm commitment to true reform. The accession of James I in 63 brought a measure of stability to the English throne, but his religious policies would prove a double-edged sword for the Puritans. On one hand, James's learned demeanor and theological inclinations led him to engage with Puritan divines, fostering an atmosphere of debate and discussion. The king's own writings, such as his Basilicon Doron, revealed a nuanced understanding of Presbyterianism, which seemed to hold out hope for a more congenial relationship between the monarch and his Puritan subjects. Yet, James's commitment to the established church and its hierarchical structure ultimately led him to reinforce the very institutions that Puritans found most objectionable. The king's policies, as embodied in the Hampton Court Conference of 1604, aimed at consolidating Anglican orthodoxy while suppressing what he saw as the more extreme elements of Puritanism. This tension would simmer throughout James's reign as Puritans chafed against the constraints of a church that seemed increasingly hostile to their ideals. At the heart of Puritan theology lay a profound commitment to the authority of Scripture, which they saw as the sole arbiter of faith and practice. Their worship, characterized by simplicity, spontaneity, and an emphasis on preaching, stood in stark contrast to the more formalized rituals of the Church of England. For Puritans, the ideal of a gathered church, where believers came together voluntarily to form a covenanted community, represented the truest expression of Christian fellowship. As the years passed, however, the pressure to conform or separate grew increasingly intense. The canons of 1604, which mandated strict adherence to Anglican doctrine and practice, forced many Puritan clergy to choose between compromise and defiance. Those who refused to submit faced harassment, loss of livelihood, and even imprisonment. The consequences of nonconformity were starkly illustrated by the case of William Bradshaw, a Puritan minister who, in 1605, was suspended from his living for refusing to wear the surplice, a symbol of Anglican clerical attire that many Puritans saw as popish. As the years of persecution and harassment took their toll on English Puritans, a subtle yet significant distinction began to emerge within their ranks. While many non-separating Puritans continued to advocate for reform from within the Church of England, a smaller but determined group of separatists, led by men like John Robinson and William Brewster, concluded that true purity could only be achieved through a complete break with the established church. This faction, having already experienced the hardships of exile in Holland, now set their sights on the New World, where they hoped to establish a beacon of unadulterated Christianity. It was against this backdrop that the Mayflower, a sturdy English vessel, set sail from Plymouth, England, on September 6, 1620, bound for the distant shores of North America. On board were 102 passengers, including men, women, and children, who would become the vanguard of the Great Puritan Migration. The Atlantic crossing proved a grueling ordeal, with treacherous storms and cramped quarters testing the resolve of even the most hardened travelers. Yet, as the ship navigated the unpredictable waters, a sense of community and shared purpose began to take hold among the passengers. On November 11, 1620, after 66 days at sea, the Mayflower dropped anchor in Provincetown Harbor, marking the beginning of a new chapter in American history. As the passengers disembarked onto the rocky shoreline, they found themselves in uncharted territory, both physically and spiritually. It was here, on the eve of their journey into the unknown, that the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact, a remarkable document that would serve as the foundation for their fledgling community. This compact, signed by 41 male passengers, established a framework for governance, promising to combine ourselves together into a civil body politique and to enact laws for the general good. The early months at Plymouth Colony were marked by struggle and hardship as the Pilgrims grappled with the unforgiving environment and their own inexperience. The winter of 1620-21 proved particularly devastating, with disease and malnutrition claiming the lives of nearly half the original passengers. Yet, even as they faced these daunting challenges, the Pilgrims demonstrated a remarkable capacity for resilience and adaptability. They learned to navigate the complex web of relationships with the local Wampanoag tribe, whose leader, Massasoit, would become a crucial ally in their quest for survival. The Wampanoag, under Massasoit's wise leadership, had initially viewed the English with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. However, as the Pilgrims demonstrated their commitment to peaceful coexistence and their willingness to learn from the native population, a tentative friendship began to take hold. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims essential skills such as farming and hunting, which would prove crucial to their survival in the New World. In return, the English offered trade goods and a promise of mutual defense, forging a bond that would endure for decades to come. As the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony struggled to establish a foothold in the New World, the situation for their brethren back in England took a turn for the worse. The accession of Charles I to the throne in 1625 marked the beginning of a new era of religious repression, as the monarch sought to enforce conformity with the Church of England. William Laud, a staunch supporter of the king's policies, rose to prominence as Bishop of London and later Archbishop of Canterbury, becoming the driving force behind the persecution of Puritan ministers. Laud's zeal for enforcing conformity led to a crackdown on nonconformist clergy, with many Puritan ministers facing harassment, imprisonment, and even deportation. The Crown's efforts to suppress dissenting voices created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, as ministers like Alexander Leighton and Henry Burton were targeted for their outspoken criticism of the Church of England. Leighton, in particular, suffered brutally at the hands of the authorities, being fined, imprisoned, and mutilated for his refusal to recant his views. The economic strain on England during this period further exacerbated the growing discontent among the population. The kingdom was plagued by poverty, inflation, and unemployment, which eroded the standard of living for many ordinary people. As the economy faltered, the government's attempts to raise revenue through unpopular measures like forced loans and monopolies only served to increase resentment towards the crown. The Petition of Right, presented to Charles I in 1628, was a desperate attempt by Parliament to address these grievances, but the king's refusal to compromise only deepened the sense of crisis. For many English Puritans, the deteriorating situation at home made the prospect of migration to the New World increasingly appealing. The success of the Plymouth Colony, despite its early struggles, had demonstrated that a new life in America was possible, and the promise of religious freedom and economic opportunity proved irresistible to those facing persecution and hardship. As the number of migrants began to swell, the decision to leave England was no longer seen as a desperate measure, but rather as a calculated choice for those seeking to escape the escalating repression and build a better future. The years 608 and 609 saw a significant increase in the number of Puritans making the journey to America, with many settling in the Massachusetts Bay Area. The Reverend John Cotton, a prominent Puritan minister, was among those who chose to migrate during this period, bringing with him a sizable contingent of followers from his congregation in Boston, Lincolnshire. As more and more English Puritans made the crossing, the seeds of a major migration were sown, one that would eventually give rise to a vast and vibrant community of English settlers in the New World. As the migration of English Puritans to America gained momentum, a pivotal moment arrived in 1630 with the arrival of the Winthrop fleet, a convoy of 11 ships carrying over 1,000 passengers, including women, children, and livestock. This mass family migration marked a significant shift from the earlier, more scattered settlements, as it brought a substantial and cohesive community to the New World. At the helm of this endeavor was John Winthrop, a charismatic leader who would play a central role in shaping the future of Massachusetts Bay. On board the Arbella, the flagship of the fleet, Winthrop delivered a sermon that would become a defining moment in American history. His "City Upon a Hill" speech, preached to the assembled passengers, outlined a vision for a new society that would serve as a beacon of hope and a model for Christian living. With eloquence and conviction, Winthrop exhorted his fellow travelers to strive for a community that would be a shining example of righteousness, where the principles of justice, equality, and freedom would guide their actions. This powerful oration set the tone for the settlement of Massachusetts Bay, as the migrants sought to create a society that would reflect the highest ideals of their faith. Upon arrival in America, the Winthrop fleet anchored in Salem Harbor, but it soon became clear that the area was not suitable for a large-scale settlement. After some exploration, the migrants decided to establish their main settlement at Boston, which they named after the town in Lincolnshire from which many of them had originated. The site, with its excellent harbor and access to fertile land, offered a promising foundation for a thriving community. As the settlers began to build their new homes, they also established surrounding towns, such as Charlestown, Cambridge, and Roxbury, each with its own distinct character and purpose. The Congregational church structure, which had been adopted by the Puritans in England, was transplanted to New England, where it played a central role in shaping the social and spiritual fabric of the community. Each town had its own church, with a pastor and a group of elders who governed the congregation and provided spiritual guidance. This system allowed for a high degree of autonomy and flexibility, as each church was free to manage its own affairs and respond to local needs. The congregational structure also fostered a strong sense of community, as members came together regularly for worship, prayer, and mutual support. As the settlers worked to transplant English society to New England, they brought with them many of the customs, traditions, and institutions that had shaped their lives in the old country. They established a system of government based on the English model, with a governor, assistants, and a general court that made laws and administered justice. They also introduced English farming practices, such as crop rotation and animal husbandry, which allowed them to cultivate the land and raise livestock with greater efficiency. However, they were also forced to adapt to the harsh realities of the New World, where the climate, soil, and native populations presented challenges that required innovative solutions and a willingness to learn from their mistakes. As the Massachusetts Bay settlement expanded, the migrants turned their attention to building godly communities with a focus on creating orderly and functional towns. Between 1631 and 1635, the settlers developed a system of town planning which allocated land to residents based on their social status and economic means. In Boston, for example, the wealthiest merchants and ministers were granted large tracts of land near the harbor, while smaller parcels were assigned to artisans and laborers. This hierarchical distribution of land reflected the Puritans' emphasis on social hierarchy and their desire to maintain a stable and respectable community. Church membership played a crucial role in civic participation during this period. To become a freeman, with the right to vote and hold public office, a man had to be a member of the church. This meant that he had to demonstrate a credible profession of faith, undergo a rigorous examination by the church elders, and be accepted as a full member of the congregation. Women, while not eligible for freemanship, were encouraged to participate in church life and were expected to adhere to the same standards of piety and moral conduct as their male counterparts. In practice, this meant that women played a vital role in maintaining the spiritual and social fabric of the community, even if they were excluded from formal positions of authority. Education was highly valued in these early Puritan communities, particularly for religious purposes. Settlers believed that literacy was essential for reading the Bible and understanding God's will, and they established schools to teach children the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. In 1635, the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded Harvard College, which would become a hub for theological education and training for future ministers. The college's curriculum emphasized biblical studies, theology, and classical languages, with the goal of producing learned and pious leaders who could guide the community in its spiritual and civic endeavors. Within these communities, traditional gender roles and family life were deeply ingrained. Men were expected to provide for their families through hard work and responsible stewardship, while women managed the household, raised children, and maintained the family's moral and spiritual well-being. The Puritans believed that a well-ordered family was essential to a healthy society, and they placed a strong emphasis on patriarchal authority and wifely submission. However, this did not mean that women were without influence or agency. Many played important roles as advisors, counselors, and mediators within their families and communities. As the settlements grew and prospered, the Puritans also developed a system of moral discipline and communal oversight to maintain social order and enforce godly standards. Each town had its own network of informants and monitors who reported on instances of misconduct, such as drunkenness, adultery, or Sabbath breaking. The church elders and civil magistrates worked together to investigate these reports, impose punishments, and provide correction and guidance to offenders. This system of communal oversight was designed to promote a culture of accountability, mutual support, and collective responsibility for maintaining the moral integrity of the community. In practice, this meant that the Puritans developed a range of social and institutional mechanisms to regulate behavior and enforce conformity. For example, they established a system of watching or surveillance, where neighbors were encouraged to monitor one another's behavior and report any suspicious activity to the authorities. They also developed a network of church-run courts and councils, which heard cases involving moral offenses, such as fornication or theft, and imposed punishments ranging from public shaming to corporal punishment. As the Puritan communities continued to grow and evolve, the seeds of dissent were sown, threatening to upend the delicate balance of power and orthodoxy. In 1636, Roger Williams, a charismatic and unconventional minister, found himself at odds with the Massachusetts Bay Colony's leadership over issues of religious tolerance and the relationship between church and state. Williams's advocacy for the separation of church and state, as well as his criticism of the colony's treatment of Native Americans, earned him powerful enemies, including Governor John Winthrop. The tensions came to a head in October 1635, when Williams was put on trial for his views and subsequently banished from the colony. Undeterred, Williams made his way to the southern tip of Narragansett Bay, where he founded the settlement of Providence, which would eventually become the nucleus of the Rhode Island colony. This bold experiment in religious freedom and tolerance would serve as a beacon for those seeking refuge from the strictures of Puritan orthodoxy. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, another controversy was brewing. Anne Hutchinson, a brilliant and outspoken theologian, had begun to attract a devoted following with her radical interpretations of biblical scripture. Her emphasis on personal revelation and the role of the Holy Spirit in guiding individual believers struck at the heart of Puritan doctrine, which emphasized the authority of Scripture and the clergy. As Hutchinson's influence grew, so did the alarm among the colony's leaders, who saw her teachings as a threat to their authority and the social order. The Antinomian controversy, as it came to be known, pitted Hutchinson and her followers against the Puritan establishment, with Winthrop and other prominent ministers denouncing her views as heretical. The controversy reached its climax in 1637, when Hutchinson was put on trial for her alleged transgressions. Despite a spirited defense, she was ultimately found guilty and banished from the colony, forced to flee to Rhode Island, where she would eventually find refuge with Roger Williams. The Hutchinson affair highlighted the limits of religious tolerance within the Puritan communities, revealing deep-seated fears about the dangers of unchecked individualism and the potential for chaos and disorder. The episode also underscored the tensions between the ideal of a unified, godly community and the reality of diverse perspectives and competing interests. As the controversy played out, it became clear that the Puritan leadership was willing to use exile, banishment, and other forms of social control to maintain orthodoxy and suppress dissent. The fragmentation of the Puritan movement was now underway, with Rhode Island emerging as a haven for those seeking greater freedom of conscience and worship. The strain on Puritan unity was palpable, as erstwhile allies found themselves on opposite sides of the theological divide. Winthrop and his supporters saw themselves as defenders of the faith, while Williams, Hutchinson, and their followers viewed them as rigid enforcers of a narrow orthodoxy. As the Puritan leadership struggled to maintain unity and orthodoxy within their communities, the settlers' expansion into native lands continued unabated. The year 1636 saw a significant increase in English settlement along the Connecticut River, with the establishment of new towns such as Hartford and Windsor. This encroachment onto traditional Native American territory did not go unnoticed, and tensions between the Puritans and the indigenous population began to escalate. The Pequot tribe, in particular, found themselves at odds with the expanding English settlements. The Pequot had long been a dominant force in the region, controlling a significant portion of the trade and commerce along the coast. However, as the English settlements grew, they began to encroach on Pequot territory, leading to conflicts over land and resources. In May 1636, a series of skirmishes broke out between English settlers and Pequot warriors, marking the beginning of the Pequot War. The conflict quickly intensified, with both sides committing atrocities against each other. The English, led by Captain John Mason and Captain John Underhill, launched a series of raids against Pequot villages, burning homes and crops and killing or capturing many of the inhabitants. The Pequot, in turn, launched retaliatory attacks against English settlements, killing several settlers and destroying their property. The war raged on for over a year, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The militarization of the New England colonies was a direct result of the Pequot War. The English recognized that they needed a more organized and effective military presence in order to protect their settlements and expand their territory. In response, they established a series of militias made up of local settlers who were tasked with defending their communities against Native American attacks. These militias were often poorly trained and equipped, but they played a crucial role in the war effort. As the Pequot War dragged on, regional power dynamics began to shift. The English colonies, which had previously been relatively isolated from one another, began to form alliances and coordinate their efforts in order to counter the Native American threat. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, in particular, emerged as a dominant force in the region, with its governor, John Winthrop, playing a key role in coordinating the military response to the Pequot. The consequences of the Pequot War were devastating for the Native American population. Estimates suggest that between 400 and 600 Pequot warriors were killed during the conflict, along with an unknown number of women and children. Many more were taken captive and sold into slavery, while others were forced to flee their ancestral lands in search of safety. The war marked a significant turning point in the history of Native American and English relations in New England, as it paved the way for further English expansion and the displacement of indigenous populations. In August 1637, the English launched a final, decisive attack against the Pequot, known as the Battle of Mystic. Led by Captain Mason and Captain Underhill, a force of approximately 200 English soldiers and their Mohegan allies attacked a Pequot village near the Mystic River, killing an estimated 400–500 Native Americans, mostly women and children. The battle marked the end of the Pequot War and the beginning of a new era of English dominance in the region. The aftermath of the war saw a significant increase in English settlement and expansion into Native American territory. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, in particular, emerged as a major power broker in the region, with its governor John Winthrop playing a key role in shaping the colony's relations with Native American tribes. As the English continued to expand their territory, they began to establish new trade relationships with other Native American groups, further solidifying their position in the region. As the Pequot War drew to a close, significant political changes were unfolding in England that would have a profound impact on the New England colonies. In 1639, King Charles I, who had been at odds with Parliament for years, faced growing opposition to his rule, culminating in the English Civil War. This conflict would ultimately lead to the king's execution and the establishment of a republic in England, but in the short term, it brought about a decline in transatlantic migration. With the outbreak of war, many Englishmen who had considered migrating to New England were now drawn into the conflict, fighting for either the royalist or parliamentarian cause. The decrease in migration had a significant impact on the demographic transformation of New England. By 1640, the population of the Massachusetts Bay Colony had grown to approximately 20,000 people, but the rate of growth was slowing. The colony's leaders, including John Winthrop, began to focus on consolidating their gains and establishing a more stable government. This led to the creation of a new system of laws known as the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which would serve as a model for future American governance. The Puritan influence on American culture was already beginning to manifest in significant ways. The emphasis on education, hard work, and community had created a unique social dynamic in New England, one that valued individual responsibility and collective prosperity. However, this same emphasis also led to contradictions and tensions within the Puritan community. For example, while the Puritans believed in the importance of education, they also limited access to it, restricting it primarily to males from wealthy families. As the English Civil War raged on, New England's colonists found themselves drawn into the conflict, albeit indirectly. Many had family ties or business connections with those fighting in England, and some even sent financial support to their preferred faction. However, the colony's physical distance from the conflict allowed them to maintain a degree of neutrality, focusing instead on building their own distinct society. In 1640, the Massachusetts Bay Colony played host to a significant event that would have lasting implications for American governance. The colony's leaders, including John Winthrop and Thomas Dudley, engaged in a series of debates over the nature of authority and the role of government. These discussions, which took place in the context of the English Civil War, laid the groundwork for future American political ideals, including the concept of representative government and the importance of protecting individual rights. The year 1640 also saw the establishment of the first permanent town governments in New England. In Massachusetts, this led to the creation of a system of selectmen who were responsible for overseeing local affairs and collecting taxes. This system, which was modeled on English parish governments, would become a hallmark of American local governance. As the decade drew to a close, the Puritans' religious ideals continued to shape their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. However, the contradictions and complexities of their beliefs were also becoming more apparent. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 would ultimately lead to a re-evaluation of the Puritans' relationship with the English monarchy, but for now, they remained focused on building their own unique society in the New World. As we conclude our exploration of the Great Puritan Migration, it becomes clear that this pivotal moment in American history has had a lasting impact on the country's development, shaping its values, institutions, and identity. The courage, conviction, and perseverance of the Puritans have left an indelible mark on the nation, influencing everything from education and governance to social dynamics and cultural norms. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that the seeds of freedom, resilience, and determination sown in the 17th century continue to bear fruit today. As we reflect on the complexities and contradictions of this remarkable era, we are reminded that history is not just a series of events, but a rich tapestry of human experiences that continue to inspire, challenge, and shape us. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. Until we meet again, I'm Herodotus, reminding you that history isn't just a story, it's our story. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.